No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life. They probably would have if it'd been like everybody.
The world believes it already knows how Elvis Presley died. The king of rock and roll, gone too soon at just 42 years old. His final moments wrapped in tragedy, scandal, and endless rumors. The headlines painted a story of drugs, excess, and self-destruction. Fans wept, tabloids feasted, and history closed the book with an ending as chaotic as his fame. But what if the truth was never fully revealed? What if those final hours inside Graceland were far more complex than the world was told? For decades, whispers spread about cover-ups, medical negligence, and unanswered questions. And now, after years of silence, Elvis Presley's own doctor steps forward to tell his side. His account uncovers shocking details hidden from the public for decades, that could change everything you thought you knew about the king's death. This isn't the legend. This isn't the rumor mill. This is the truth about Elvis Presley's final hours, told by the man who was there when the king took his last breath. August 16, 1977, began like so many other restless mornings for Elvis Presley inside the walls of Graceland. The night before had been long and sleepless, as most of his nights had been during those last years. Insomnia plagued him, gnawing away at his ability to rest, and when he did manage to close his eyes, it was often with the aid of heavy prescription medications. Those who saw him that morning recalled a man who was tired, yet still filled with determination, a man clinging to the routine that had defined his life even as his body betrayed him. Elvis was preparing for yet another tour, scheduled to begin in just a few days, and the pressure weighed heavily. Fans were still expecting the electrifying performer who had once made the world scream with just a smile and a hip shake. But the reality was different. His health had been deteriorating rapidly. He carried the burden of being not just a superstar, but the king, a title that demanded he never show weakness. His friends and family had grown accustomed to his unpredictable moods, his exhaustion, and his growing dependence on medication to function. That morning, Elvis moved slowly, his body heavier than before, his face bloated from years of unhealthy habits. Still, he pushed forward, making plans for the day. He spoke with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, about upcoming concerts, and even playfully spent time with her, trying to keep spirits high. To outsiders, it might have seemed like an ordinary day for a man of his status. But inside his body, a storm was brewing. His heart was struggling, already enlarged to nearly twice its normal size. His colon was severely impacted, his liver scarred, and his arteries strained under the weight of years of abuse. Elvis had built an empire on energy and charisma, but now he was running on fumes. Yet, like a soldier marching into battle, he carried himself with a stubborn pride that refused to admit weakness. His doctor would later reveal that Elvis had been showing alarming signs for months: shortness of breath, fainting spells, and extreme fatigue. The king ignored them all, determined to live life on his own terms. As he walked through Graceland that morning, greeting those around him, nobody knew they were watching his final hours unfold. The king of rock and roll, who had commanded stages across the globe, was beginning a day that would end not in rehearsals, not in music, but in tragedy. Behind the golden gates of Graceland, the king of rock and roll was living a reality far removed from the legend adored by millions. To the outside world, Elvis Presley was still the glittering icon who could dazzle audiences with his voice and presence. But behind the curtains, the truth was far more troubling. His health had been deteriorating for years, and those closest to him saw the decline long before the public did. According to his doctor, Elvis was not just battling fatigue or the occasional illness. His body was ravaged by a series of serious medical conditions. His heart, the engine that had carried him through years of electrifying performances, was dangerously enlarged. His colon was chronically impacted, sometimes leaving him in excruciating pain. His liver showed signs of permanent damage, and his eyes were weakened by glaucoma. These weren't minor ailments. They were life-threatening conditions compounded by the relentless pressure to keep performing, to keep being Elvis Presley. And then there was the medication. Elvis had developed an extreme dependency on prescription drugs, painkillers, sedatives, stimulants. His daily regimen often looked less like treatment and more like chemical survival. His doctor would later admit that the combinations were risky, sometimes reckless, but Elvis demanded them. He needed them not just to endure the stage, but to simply get through the day. He couldn't sleep without them. He couldn't wake up without them. He couldn't face the physical pain that came with years of abuse to his body without them. The irony was painful. The same man who inspired millions with his vitality and energy was himself being kept upright by pills. Friends and family whispered their concerns. Band members noticed how sluggish he had become. Fans who saw him in the last years noticed a heavier figure, a man who sometimes slurred his words or forgot lyrics, a man who seemed to fade before their eyes. But Elvis wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. His identity was built on being larger than life, on being the king, and slowing down felt like a betrayal to the very legacy he had built. In interviews, Dr. Nick would later confess that Presley's health was so fragile, he was essentially living on borrowed time. Every new tour, every new performance, every late night inside Graceland came with the risk that his body would finally give out. Yet Elvis never saw himself as sick. He saw himself as a man still destined to deliver, still expected to rise to the occasion. He ignored the swelling in his body, the dizziness, the fainting spells. He brushed off warnings and begged his doctor for just enough help to keep moving. To the world, he was still the king. But inside his home, inside his body, Elvis Presley was a man in crisis, balancing on a razor's edge between survival and collapse. For Elvis Presley, his doctor was far more than a physician. He was a gatekeeper, a confidant, and sometimes the only person who truly understood the price the king was paying for his fame. Dr. George Nicopolis, known simply as Dr. Nick, had been with Elvis for years. He had treated him through highs and lows, through comebacks and collapses, and he knew better than anyone the truth about Presley's condition. To the public, Dr. Nick was often vilified, painted as the man who enabled Elvis's decline. But when he finally broke his silence, his story was not one of negligence, but of desperation. He described a patient unlike any other. Elvis was not just a man, but a global symbol. And symbols are not allowed to rest. Every promoter, every fan, every family member wanted the king to keep going, to keep performing, to keep being the legend. And Elvis himself demanded it most of all. He refused to slow down, refused to admit defeat. He would look Dr. Nick in the eye and insist he was fine, even as his body was crumbling. Dr. Nick recalled how Elvis's daily requests for medication grew more complex over time. It was not a matter of a single pill here or there. It became cocktails of drugs, uppers to wake him, downers to sleep, painkillers to numb the aches of a body battered by years of touring, performing, and poor diet. The doctor tried to regulate it, to manage it, but Presley was a stubborn man. He was the king. He expected solutions, not lectures, And if Dr. Nick didn't provide them, Elvis could find someone else who would. The responsibility was crushing. The doctor knew the risks. He saw the warning signs every day. Elvis's bloated appearance, his labored breathing, his forgetfulness, his weakness. But each time he tried to intervene, he was met with resistance. Elvis didn't want sympathy. He wanted to be on stage. He wanted to be the man the world expected. Dr. Nick later confessed that he sometimes felt trapped, caught between the oath of medicine and the reality of managing the most famous entertainer on earth. He prescribed because Elvis demanded it, because canceling a show or postponing a tour was unthinkable in the Presley empire. To stop was to admit defeat, and Elvis Presley would never do that. In the doctor's eyes, he was not enabling Elvis but buying him time, keeping him alive long enough to fulfill the demands of fame. But deep down, he knew it was unsustainable. Each year, each tour, each long night in Graceland was wearing the king down. By 1977, Dr. Nick admitted, Elvis's health was so fragile that he lived in constant fear of the phone ringing with bad news. And on August 16th, that call came, not as a shock, but as the fulfillment of fears that had haunted him for years. The final hours of Elvis Presley's life unfolded quietly inside the walls of Graceland, the mansion that had been both his palace and his prison. On August 16, 1977, Elvis spent much of the day in the company of his fiancée, Ginger Alden. Friends and family members recalled that he seemed tired but oddly hopeful, speaking of upcoming plans and preparing for his next tour, set to begin in just days. To those around him, it was another restless day in the life of the king. But beneath the surface, his body was nearing collapse. He moved slower than before. His speech sometimes slurred, and his face showed the unmistakable signs of exhaustion. Yet Elvis was determined to maintain a sense of normalcy. He read books in his bedroom, played with Ginger, and even made plans for the evening. His life may have been surrounded by chaos, but on that day, he seemed to be searching for calm. As night turned to morning, Elvis retreated into his private world. He was a man of habit, and one of those habits was his late-night routines. He often spent hours alone, reading spiritual texts or talking quietly with those he trusted. Ginger later recalled that Elvis seemed upbeat in their final conversations, discussing marriage and the future, even joking lightly as he prepared to head into his bathroom. It was a side of him the public never saw, a man still clinging to dreams despite his weary body. But what Ginger did not realize was that this would be the last time she saw Elvis alive. Sometime after 2 a.m., Elvis disappeared into the bathroom of his master suite. Hours passed, and when Ginger awoke later in the morning, she noticed he was still gone. Concerned, she called out for him. But there was no response. When she finally entered the room, the sight before her was devastating. Elvis lay face down on the floor, motionless and unresponsive. Panic surged through the house as Ginger screamed for help. His bodyguard and staff rushed to the scene, but it was too late. The king of rock and roll, the man who had filled stadiums with his energy and charmed millions with his smile, lay silent on the cold bathroom floor. When Dr. Nick was called, he already knew this was the moment he had long feared. For years, he had worried that Elvis's body would eventually give in, and now, staring at the unresponsive figure of his patient and friend, that fear was a reality. Elvis Presley, the man who seemed larger than life, had collapsed in the most ordinary of places, alone in his bathroom. It was an ending that shocked the world, but for those who truly knew him, it was a tragedy long in the making. The moment Elvis Presley was discovered unresponsive on the bathroom floor, chaos ripped through the walls of Graceland. Ginger Alden's cries for help brought bodyguards and staff rushing into the room, each one stunned by the sight before them. The king of rock and roll, the man who had seemed untouchable, lay face down, pale and lifeless. At first, there was disbelief. They tried to shake him, to call his name, to will him back to consciousness, but nothing worked. Someone quickly called for an ambulance as others attempted to administer CPR, though few truly knew how. Within minutes, paramedics from the Memphis Fire Department arrived at Graceland. They found Elvis in critical condition, his heart stopped, his skin clammy, and his body already showing signs of having been down for some time. The medics worked frantically, applying chest compressions, inserting equipment, trying to revive a man whose body had endured far too much for far too long. Dr. Nick soon arrived, rushing past the gates he had entered countless times before, but this time it was different. He later admitted that when he saw Elvis, he knew immediately that the chances were slim. Still, he did everything in his power, ordering resuscitation attempts and urging the team to keep going. The urgency was overwhelming, but so was the sense of inevitability. With Elvis's massive frame being carried out on a stretcher, witnesses recalled the surreal scene. Neighbors peering from behind fences, fans gathered near the gates, and the flashing lights of the ambulance piercing the Memphis morning. Graceland, once a sanctuary of music and laughter, had turned into the setting of a desperate fight to save the world's greatest entertainer. As the ambulance sped toward Baptist Memorial Hospital, medics continued their efforts, shocking his chest, delivering oxygen, and refusing to give up. But Dr. Nick, riding alongside, understood the grim reality. He had seen Elvis's decline up close for years, and he knew that the king's heart, already twice its normal size, was failing beyond repair. At the hospital, teams of doctors and nurses took over, flooding the room with every effort known to modern medicine. For 30 minutes, they tried to restore life to Elvis Presley, using every possible method, from adrenaline injections to defibrillation, but nothing worked. The silence grew heavier with every passing second, until finally, at 3:30 p.m., Elvis Presley was officially pronounced dead. In that moment, the king of rock and roll was gone. The hospital staff who had grown used to treating celebrities now stood in shock. Nurses wept, doctors bowed their heads, and Dr. Nick, the man who had been at Elvis's side for so long, could only watch in devastation. It was over. The superstar who had once seemed larger than life had been reduced to silence. Outside, word spread like wildfire. Radio stations broke the news within minutes. Fans across Memphis sobbed in disbelief, and before long, the world was in mourning. The emergency response had done all it could, but no amount of medicine, no number of doctors, could turn back the years of damage Elvis's body had endured. The king's final curtain had fallen, and there was no encore. When Elvis Presley was pronounced dead on August 16, 1977, the shock was immediate and worldwide. But inside Baptist Memorial Hospital, and later within the walls of Graceland, another storm was brewing, one not of grief, but of secrecy. The doctors knew that the autopsy results would ignite controversy, and already whispers spread that the world could never be told the entire truth. Within hours, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco announced that Elvis had died of cardiac arrhythmia, essentially heart failure. To the public, it sounded straightforward. The king's heart simply gave out. But behind the scenes, the toxicology reports painted a far more complicated picture. Elvis's blood contained high levels of multiple prescription medications, painkillers, sedatives, barbiturates, and stimulants. It was not one drug, but a dangerous cocktail that had pushed an already weak body past its breaking point. Dr. Nick, along with other insiders, later admitted that Elvis's heart was so enlarged and diseased that even without the drugs, his time was limited. Still, the presence of those medications could not be ignored. And so began what many call one of the greatest cover-ups in music history. To protect Elvis's image, to shield his family, and perhaps to protect his doctors, officials carefully crafted the official narrative. Instead of drugs and decline, the story became one of a simple heart attack, a tragedy that could be mourned without scandal. But the truth refused to stay buried. When portions of the toxicology report were leaked, journalists jumped on the inconsistencies. Why had the official cause been released before the tests were even completed? Why were the details about drug levels minimized or dismissed? Fans demanded answers, and the press demanded accountability. For years afterward, debates raged about whether Elvis had died from heart disease, from an overdose, or from a toxic combination of both. Some insisted that the public was being lied to, that powerful figures had intervened to rewrite the narrative. Dr. Nick found himself at the center of the storm. Accused of overprescribing and enabling, he defended himself by pointing to Elvis's already failing health. He argued that Presley's death was inevitable, that his body was ravaged by years of abuse and stress, and that the drugs merely hastened the inevitable. Still, the shadow of suspicion never left him. Lawsuits, investigations, and even medical board hearings followed him for years, each one reopening the painful wound of the king's death. The autopsy, rather than providing closure, had become the foundation of endless controversy. To this day, many fans believe the truth about Elvis's final hours remains buried beneath layers of protection, loyalty, and denial. What is certain, however, is that the official story was incomplete. The king's heart may have stopped beating, but the real causes stretched far beyond a simple arrhythmia. They reached into the world of fame, pressure, addiction, and the desperate measures taken to keep a legend alive, until the very end. In the years that followed Elvis Presley's death, Dr. George Nichopoulos, forever known as Dr. Nick, found himself under relentless scrutiny. For millions of grieving fans, someone had to take the blame. And many were quick to point their fingers at the man who had prescribed Elvis's endless stream of medications. Court documents revealed that, in the final year of Presley's life alone, Dr. Nick had written thousands of prescriptions, filling them with powerful narcotics, sedatives, and stimulants. To the world, it seemed clear. The doctor had enabled the king's decline. But when Dr. Nick finally spoke, his words painted a very different picture. He insisted that he had not been careless or corrupt, but trapped in an impossible situation. Elvis Presley, he explained, was not a typical patient. He was a superstar who lived by his own rules. A man so determined to keep performing and so resistant to slowing down that no ordinary medical advice would suffice. According to Dr. Nick, he often tried to reduce the king's intake, but Elvis would simply find another way to get what he wanted. By writing the prescriptions himself, Dr. Nick claimed, he could at least monitor and control what Elvis was taking, rather than risk the singer turning to dangerous black market sources. In his mind, it was not enabling. It was damage control. He confessed that he knew the risks, that he saw Elvis's health spiraling downward. But what was the alternative? Cancel the tours? Say no to the king of rock and roll? To Dr. Nick, that would have meant losing Elvis's trust and leaving him vulnerable to far worse. In interviews, he often expressed guilt, not necessarily for what he did, but for what he could not prevent. He admitted that he had grown attached to Elvis, not just as a patient, but as a friend. He had seen his struggles up close, the loneliness, the pressure, the constant demand to be larger than life. He had watched as Elvis drowned his pain in pills, Not because he wanted to get high, but because he wanted to function, to keep giving himself to the world. Critics, however, were not convinced. In 1981, Dr. Nick was indicted on charges related to overprescribing, accused of fueling Elvis's drug dependency. Though he was eventually acquitted, the trial destroyed his reputation. His medical license was suspended, and his name was forever tied to the death of the king. The weight of that blame never left him. In later years, Dr. Nick repeatedly defended himself, insisting that Elvis's death was not caused by drugs alone, but by a body already failing from disease, stress, and years of physical strain. He said Elvis's heart was so enlarged and his system so fragile that even without the prescriptions, his days were numbered. He wanted the world to understand that he had done his best, that he had tried to protect the man behind the legend, yet no matter how often he told his side, the shadow of guilt remained. For the rest of his life, he carried the burden of being the doctor who couldn't save Elvis Presley. The death of Elvis Presley on August 16, 1977, marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of decades of questions, speculation, and sorrow. For his fans, the news was a gut punch. Radio stations broke into regular programming, anchors on television spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones, and within minutes, crowds gathered outside the gates of Graceland. Some fell to their knees in disbelief. Others clung to one another as they sobbed, unable to comprehend that the man who had redefined music and culture was suddenly gone. The world lost the king of rock and roll, but for those who loved him most, the loss was even more personal. Elvis was not just a superstar. He was a son, a father, a friend, and a man who carried the weight of fame heavier than anyone ever should. His death, and the details surrounding it, revealed not just the fragility of a body pushed beyond its limits, but the crushing toll of living life as a legend. His doctor's account of those final hours, once shrouded in secrecy, forces us to look beyond the headlines and see Elvis for what he truly was in his last years. Not a god, not a myth, but a human being. A man exhausted by the demands of his empire. A man searching for peace in pills and routines. A man who longed for normalcy, but could never escape the spotlight. Dr. Nick's testimony is not simply about prescriptions or medical negligence. It's a window into the impossible pressure that came with being Elvis Presley. He was expected to keep touring, keep recording, keep dazzling, even when his body was failing. He was expected to embody youth, vitality, and rebellion long after his health had begun to crumble. The truth revealed by his doctor is that Elvis was living on borrowed time, fighting battles that no amount of fame or money could erase. His final hours were not the reckless collapse of a careless man, but the tragic finale of someone who gave too much of himself to the world. And while the autopsy reports, the accusations, and the investigations have lingered for decades, none of them can overshadow the legacy of his life. Elvis Presley's story does not end on that bathroom floor. It lives on in the music that still shakes arenas, in the movies that still light up screens, and in the millions of fans who keep his memory alive. His songs continue to play at weddings, at concerts, on long drives, and in quiet moments of reflection. His image still draws pilgrims to Graceland, where candles are lit and flowers are laid year after year. The king is gone, but his presence remains everywhere. Yet, knowing the truth about his final hours gives his story new depth. It reminds us that behind the rhinestones and the headlines, Elvis was mortal. He suffered, he struggled. He leaned on those around him, including his doctor, to keep going when he no longer had the strength. The legacy of those last hours is not one of scandal, but of humanity. It shows that even legends break, even kings fall, and that greatness often comes at an unbearable cost. Today, we remember Elvis not for the way he died, but for the way he lived, for the joy he brought, the barriers he broke, and the music that forever changed the world. And perhaps that is the final truth his doctor wanted us to understand. That Elvis Presley's final hours may have been tragic, but they do not define him. What defines him is everything he gave before them. The songs, the spirit, the fire, and the heart of a man who, despite his flaws and fragility, remains immortal in the eyes of those who still call him the King.